All right. All right. I know folks are still joining, but I've got a lot of content today, so I'm going to get started. And this session is being recorded, so you'll be able to reference it later and share it with others. We'll post it to bikeleague.org/community. And please feel free to put in questions in the chat at any time. And if we have time at the end, we'll get to them. And I have Anna here with me answering in real time anything she can, and anything we can't get to, we'll answer afterwards. So thank you everyone for being here. My name is Amelia Neptune. I'm the director of the Bicycle Friendly America program at the League of American Bicyclists, and I'm joined by my colleague, Anna Tang. I'll let you introduce yourself, Anna.
I'm Anna Tang. I am the Bicycle Friendly America program coordinator, and I work with Amelia on all things BFA related, and I'm happy to be here today.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so just real quickly, if you're not familiar with the League, we're a national nonprofit bike advocacy organization leading the movement to build the movement for safer streets and a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. And Anna and I work on our Bicycle Friendly America program, which includes the Bicycle Friendly state rankings, as well as evaluation and recognition programs for communities, businesses, and universities. And today's presentation is focused primarily on the community program, but you should know that a lot of what we're talking about today will eventually be integrated into both the business program and the university programs as well. And those will be coming soon in the next year or so. So stay tuned for more about the business and university programs. So first, just to give a sort of some background about why we are doing an equity update to the bicycle friendly community application and what is equity. And I use this infographic in every presentation I give. So if you're attending for the third time this week or you've attended before, thanks for putting up with some repeat slides. But I think this is a great one to share, and I encourage others to use it, from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, showing the difference between equality and equity, and recognizing that different people have different barriers and different accessibility needs, and therefore the same solution won't work for everyone. Just like the same bike won't work for everyone, different investments are needed, and in some cases more investments are needed in certain places than others to make up for historical disparities that exist. And on the League's website, you can find our definition of equity, which is the just and fair inclusion into a society in which everyone can participate and prosper. The goals of equity must be to create conditions that allow all to reach their full potential, erasing disparities in race, income, ability, geography, age, gender, and sexual orientation. The principle of equity acknowledges that there are historically underserved and underrepresented populations, and that fairness regarding these unbalanced conditions is needed to assist equality in the provision of effective opportunities to all groups. So I thought that was worth reading, and you can visit it on our website, on our Equity Initiative page, if you're interested. And there are a lot of other groups that have acknowledged similar disparities and with similar statements. Here's NACTO's 2021 policy platform, which includes the principle to end the racist legacy of transportation policy and planning and build an equitable and accessible transportation system. So you'll see this from a lot of other national groups, which I think is important to recognize that this is happening all across the transportation industry and the bike movement for good reason, because we do have a lot of historical disparities in barriers and outcomes, in present day barriers and outcomes. Some of the League's reports that we've released over the years point to these disparities. For example, last fall, we came out with an update to our 2013 report called The New Majority. Last year's report was Reconnecting to the New Majority, and it includes really interesting data and stats around those disparities, and also in what would move the needle to help particularly people of color and Black people to find biking more accessible, safer, more comfortable, et cetera. So I encourage you to check out that report, and you can find it on our website. And also on our website, data.bikeleague.org, there is a lot of really useful data and stats showing various disparities that exist, for example, in gender among bike commuters, in physical inactivity by various demographic groups, traffic deaths by age, low income commuters walking to work, biking to work, et cetera. And so we see these disparities across the demographics, as I've mentioned several times, and other, again, national partners of ours have pointed out why this matters, why inequity in our transportation system really matters and is important to focus on. So we'll include links to all of these reports in the follow-up, so stay tuned. When you get the recording to this webinar, you'll get all of these links as well. I also want to note that disability is an area where the Equity Initiative at the League has not had as much attention on in the past, and you'll hear today that we are elevating it as part of the equity update to the BFC application. And this video that we can put a link to in the chat is a really great resource, and just a reminder that disabled people ride bikes, and also recognizing that not everyone who has a disability recognizes or identifies as disabled, whether it's from an illness or an injury or age. There's a lot of invisible accessibility issues and accessibility needs that people have in every single community across the country. So this is a really important point for bicycle-friendly communities to recognize and understand, and that's part of why you'll see that integrated into our update that I'll be talking about today. So now to go into a little bit of the history of our 5E criteria that the bicycle-friendly community applications are evaluated on. We started to use the 5E criteria back in 2003. And in 2014, when the League had our 2-year grant to do an equity initiative from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, we integrated equity as the unofficial 6th E of the 5Es, so adding equity components to all the other E's. And when we did that effort, it was part of the larger equity initiative at the League. And I really want to give a big shout out to the folks who were behind all of that work back in 2014 and around then. Adonia Lugo, Hamza Sani, Carolyn Shapansky, and Liz Cornish were among the colleagues who I feel really fortunate to have been able to work with. And a lot of their great work is still available in the reports and resources on our website at the Equity Initiative website. And at that point, I worked closely with Adonia and a BFA Equity Advisory Committee and the rest of the BFA team to add what we called BFA beta questions to the BFC application back in 2014. So these were some questions that were added back then to try to get at some of these questions of are different demographic groups being reached with your education or your encouragement events? Are you making specific allocations of funding to underrepresented areas of the community? So we knew we weren't going to get it perfect back then, so that's why we called it BFA beta, sort of thinking that someday we would do another stab at integrating it more fully. And so today I'm really excited to be able to show you that we're taking that next step. But going back to this history, in 2020, we made the announcement that we were removing enforcement as one of the 5Es and officially elevating equity as the 5th E. And I won't go into a lot of detail about this today because we've got a lot of great resources on our website about it, including an entire presentation I did at the 2021 National Bike Summit on this topic with my colleague Ken McLeod about why we removed enforcement, what that looked like, what it actually means, because there's still a lot of talk about enforcement and accountability and transparency around enforcement and making sure that it's done equitably in the different ways that it is happening in communities in the BFC application, and also all of the policy initiatives that the League has undertaken to try to encourage upstream solutions so that communities don't have to be over-reliant on enforcement as their one and only safety strategy. So check out these resources for more information about that. But when we made that update in 2020, we knew that we had a lot of work to do to actually make equity an official 5th E. You can't just say it and announce it and consider yourself done. So last year, this was a blog post from last August, we made the announcement that we would be taking the application offline to undergo many months of listening and learning and working with bicycle-friendly communities and advocates across the country to make this update. And when we made that announcement last August, we said that we would be updating the application in three main areas, equity being the first, revising how we talk about on and off street bike infrastructure to emphasize networks and network connectivity. And then finally, just taking the opportunity to look around for the latest best practices based on new technologies, innovations, challenges that COVID brought upon us, opportunities that have come up with new technologies, et cetera. So that's what we've done over the last almost a year now. And I'm really excited to be unveiling the new BFC application this week with our official new 5 E's of engineering, education, encouragement, evaluation and planning, and equity and accessibility. So before I go into details about what this looks like and how we made this change over the last year, I want to say thank you. This has been a really incredible learning opportunity for me and the League and the BFA team. We did a survey this spring that over 150 communities responded to about their equity work, giving us a lot of details and links and examples of what they're doing. We had phone calls with dozens of advocates and local change makers. We had roundtable discussions on various specific topics. I am so appreciative to all the advocates who humored me as I sent them draft questions and got their feedback on. Communities have sent me their BPAC meeting notes where they discussed equity. Organizations have sent me their strategic plan updates. We've had 2 really amazing BFA equity fellows for the last couple of years, helping us do reviews and giving us suggestions all along the way. So this has been a really intensive process. So I just want to step back and say thank you to everyone who helped inform and educate and help us get this to where it is today. But I also want to acknowledge that we're not done. I am still learning daily on this, and I know that our bicycle-friendly communities will continue to learn too, and I'll learn from our applicants as they respond to our new questions. So we're not done making edits. This is the big edit. But we've always made iterative changes between application rounds, small minor changes, and we will continue to do that to make sure we're getting it right, to make sure we're not missing anything, to acknowledge new things that have come up in terms of best practices or new challenges, new funding opportunities, et cetera. So if you didn't get the chance to give us your input yet, we invite your input once the application is live. You can email us at the BFA team so that we can hear your input along the way as you're applying or using the application to advocate in your community. So now I'll talk a little bit about that survey that I mentioned we did this spring. We had 160 communities complete the survey asking about what they're doing currently. And so this was kind of a benchmarking survey for us. And here on the screen, you can see the distribution of award levels for what award level each respondent was. So, we have over 800 communities have participated in the program, 500 or so current awardees. So this was, a decent sample size, but obviously not every community is represented here. But we collected information on size of community and that sort of thing as well. So we can look for trends in rural and small towns versus big cities, et cetera. But on that survey, we offered a series of options. The first series was focused on engineering, the facilities, the infrastructure, the physical amenities that's offered in a community, and the efforts that have been undertaken so far to make those more equitable and accessible. And the idea, we developed this survey back in March with the thinking that these questions would in some form or another end up on the BFC application. And we just wanted to see how common some of these things were. So for this first category, you can see the results here a little bit. I'm sorry, it's probably hard to read, but we'll be releasing this information in a more legible format for folks to look through themselves. But the most common things that were happening were infrastructure or placemaking projects that intentionally reflect or incorporate the history or culture of the community. Followed by free or subsidized access to bike safety equipment or accessories like helmets, lights, locks, et cetera. So those weren't very surprising. The least common activity happening among the survey respondents was accessibility audit conducted of public bike parking. So that's definitely something we've integrated into the application, and we're working to help figure out what resources we can put in the hands of communities so that they can do this kind of work. And I'll be talking about that in just a moment. The next category on the survey was the education, engagement, events, and programming. So this is kind of a combination of education, encouragement, and a piece of evaluation and planning, but all the different ways that these kinds of engagement events can be more accessible and equitable. So here are the responses. The most common activities were bicycle classes, events, or organized rides hosted by or offered for certain affinity or identity groups, such as a women's only ride, a BIPOC only ride, etc. The next common was free or subsidized access to bike safety or related classes or learning opportunities for low-income residents. And then down at the bottom, you can see the least common activity was a limited English proficiency plan or similar for bicycle engagement, outreach, or education efforts. And that's something that we heard about on a real BFC application last fall, and that inspired us to put it on here to see how common is this. So only a handful of communities that responded to the survey are doing it. We know it's not very common yet. And language is something we've integrated into a lot of different questions on the application. So whether or not you have a formal plan, if you're doing various things to make your resources available in multiple languages, you'll be able to talk about that on your BFC application. And then the third and final section of the survey was the bicycle data collection, evaluation, planning, funding, staffing, and goal setting. So the entire evaluation and planning section, basically. But so here, the most common activity was socioeconomic or demographic data mapping incorporated into any planning or development of bike infrastructure. And the next was equity-focused analysis, such as a social vulnerability assessment, equity matrix, index, or similar effort conducted as part of a community bicycle master plan, Vision Zero action plan, Safe Routes to School plan, etc. And then the least common activity was anti-displacement program or strategies that relate to transportation investments. So with this survey, we were also able to collect a lot of great examples from communities to see what they're already doing and to be able to share these examples with communities who are looking to do some of this work. So that's really exciting. We'll be able to share these, and we're integrating some of these examples into the application. Here's one from Charlotte, North Carolina. The Corridors of Opportunity was a program that I think is worth highlighting of equitable and reparative transportation investments, where they've identified low-income portions of the community that really need extra investment, and efforts they've made to make those even better from a transportation and an economic standpoint. So now I'll go into a little more detail about the actual updates to the application and how equity is being integrated throughout. So there is now an equity and accessibility section of the application, just like each of the other E's have their own section, but it's also continually, it's going to be continually threaded throughout. And I'll give some examples of what that looks like in the various E sections. So it will live in every section and its own section, and I'll explain more so that makes some sense. So the first thing to know is we will start out your application by asking for some context. We've heard from communities that are a little concerned because maybe they're not very racially diverse. Maybe it's a really small town that doesn't have anyone who speaks a language other than English. Are they going to be dinged for not having resources available in other languages when that's not needed in their community? And this is my answer to you: no. We will try to get our best snapshot that we can of your community in the community profile section of the application. So currently we're going to be pointing communities to the census data, and the census website now has a really great, robust tool to let communities see their own profile page with all of these different stats laid out very easily, very user-friendly. And I know not every community will have this, so we'll work with the communities that don't have it. I also know that there will be situations where the census data isn't quite accurate, or it doesn't tell the full story. For example, if you have a neighborhood in the community with a much higher population of recent immigrants who, and you know a certain language is spoken really heavily in the homes in that neighborhood, but it doesn't really show up on that bigger census number citywide, you can tell us about that in that question at the very bottom, A23. And this is just an open-ended question for anything else you want to tell us to help us understand your community, so that the reviewers who are looking at your application have a better sense of what should be expected and where the priorities should lie when it comes to equity work. And the other thing I'll say on this topic is, in the engineering section, we're adding a new set of questions about regional coordination. So for the most part, the application only wants, we only want to hear about what's happening inside your borders of whatever jurisdiction is applying. And we get counties applying, we get MPOs applying, we get cities and towns, et cetera. So whatever entity is applying, we want to hear about what's happening in your borders. But on this question, these three questions, we want to hear about what you're doing across your borders. Because going back to that question of, well, our community is not very diverse. Are we going to be hurt by not having equity efforts when we don't feel we really need them? That's something we hear from some communities. And so, in addition to encouraging them to think about gender and age and disability status and the other ways that they might be diverse in their community, I also want them to think outside of their borders, because there very well may be a low-income community right next door where a lot of janitorial staff are traveling daily into your community to work at jobs in your community, but they live somewhere else, and making sure that they have a safe, comfortable way and dignified way to get to work every day if they don't have access to a car is really important, and it's the responsibility of both of those jurisdictions. So this is sort of a new philosophical shift for the BFC program to encourage communities to start thinking outside of their borders in this way. But I do think it's an important equity issue because we know that the US has a very long history of segregation within cities, but also keeping some cities contained. Not to say that that's the only reason that certain cities might not have, or towns might not have, diversity, but if that is the issue or the case in your community, we want to sort of shine a light on that and encourage communities to work with their neighbors to create cohesive networks for people traveling across the communities for work, for school, for doctor's appointments, et cetera. So I wanted to acknowledge that this question has a lot of layers, and for me, it is in part, at least, an equity question as well. I'll also point out a few of the other areas that the engineering section of the application has integrated equity and accessibility. So where we've talked about design guidance for years, we're adding 2 new design guides to the application as references to say, do you have anything like this in your design guides? And one of these, a guide to inclusive cycling, is actually out of the UK from the group Wheels for Wellbeing. And the other one is out of San Francisco, the Getting to the Curb. But these are both really great resources, and we can put the links. Thanks, Anna's already put the links in the chat. These are really great resources, and they'll be linked directly from the application to help people think about issues like universal design, or making sure the entry points to your bike paths are accessible for adaptive cycles or recumbents or trikes, or any type of bike or cycle that might be used by people of all ages and abilities, including with disabilities. Another set of new questions on the engineering section is focused on comfort and attractiveness, and some of the new options include things like public art or murals, historical or cultural information, and placemaking efforts. And those 3 answer options will have open-ended follow-up dependent fields asking for more information and allowing applicants to upload photos or additional information. So if you've done something in your community to acknowledge the original history, or an older legacy culturally or historically for your community, that's an equity issue, and can be great to highlight So we encourage you to post those as part of your application to help us understand how that has worked. And we also want to recognize how integral it is when those efforts happen to work with the community and not just, slap on some outsider consultant work on what they think the history or culture of the community is, but actually working with the residents. So we hope that the answers that communities give us here help us to see how that's happened. All right, so this was something I mentioned earlier on the survey as being the least common action that was taken, but something like an accessibility audit of end of trip facilities to see if your bike parking is accessible for an adaptive bike or a cargo bike or a tricycle, et cetera. That is one option on this series of checklists of other things that communities can do to make sure their bike parking is prevalent across the community and not just concentrated in certain neighborhoods or certain areas, but that it's available equitably everywhere. And this was also something that ranked really highly in the research we did for the Reconnecting to the New Majority report, where bike parking, high quality bike parking being available was a really high priority in the respondents of that survey to say, yes, this would make the difference for me to bike more often, particularly for people of color. So now I'll talk a little bit about equity and accessibility in education. Here's just one example. We have a series of questions about youth bike education, both in school and out of school. In school, this is the example where we've added adaptive cycling education and whether adaptive bikes are available. If there's a fleet of bikes, we know not every school is even doing bike education, much less making bikes available for on-bike education, but where it is happening, we want to really encourage it all across the country, and we want to encourage schools to think about how to make sure it's inclusive as possible. Another example here is in the education section. And for this one, I decided to do a screenshot of the online application because we've had a question like this for a number of years, since 2014, of do any of your classes, resources, or programs specifically focus on reaching the following audiences? And historically, it's just been a checklist and we don't get any follow-up information. We're keeping the checklist, but we've added follow-up dependent fields. So any box you check will result in a required field to say, tell us more. Internally on our review team, we have often wondered, are they checking the box for women if they just put a flyer in the women's bathroom and consider it done? We hope not. We want to know more. We hope there's like real authentic engagement happening here. So this is our way to find out and hold communities to a high standard, and encourage you to hold yourselves and local advocates to hold their communities to a high standard. Similarly, in encouragement, that same question exists in encouragement, and this question also exists in one form or another under both education and encouragement, but different ways that the community can work to make education, or in this case, encouragement efforts, more equitable, accessible, and inclusive. So things like providing captions and ASL interpreters, partnerships with local community groups, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Intentional efforts to ensure that imagery, photos, and videos used really reflect the diversity of the community and represent a variety of cycles and trip types. So commuters, family on cargo bikes, adaptive cycles, et cetera. So both in encouragement and in education, we want to encourage communities to think about these kinds of things and what a difference that can make in making biking feel more inclusive across the community. Another question we've changed a little bit is the question about bike clubs. In the encouragement section, historically, it's just been a checkbox of what types of bike clubs do you have. And now part of our hope with this equity update is that we will be fostering more connections across and inside communities, including between bike clubs and advocates and the applicants filling out the BFC application. So we'll now require you to tell us the names of all of the clubs, The contact fields are optional but encouraged, and we encourage you to invite these people to be involved in your application. And also recognizing that there's a wide variety of bike clubs out there. There are disabled cyclist clubs, there are people of color clubs and women's clubs, etc. So, look far and wide for the various types of clubs that exist in your community, whether it's, a community-based family biking club or a slow roll, Friday night casual social ride club, or the really serious racing on the weekends clubs. All are welcome on the application. So we encourage communities to tell us about them and learn about them themselves. So next, in the evaluation and planning section, we're adding a whole new section around public engagement and outreach, and using the IAP2 spectrum of public participation. And we can put the link to the chat to this resource, but we've pulled inspiration from this resource to develop our questions. And just to show you an example of one of the questions, this is about how engagement opportunities have been made more accessible and inclusive. So it's things like childcare is provided at public meetings, or food is provided, or sign language interpreters. Events happen not just at the public meeting at City Hall, but going out to the community at grocery stores, churches, parks, schools, barbershops, etc. So these are some of the things we expect to see, and we know we've seen in communities. And if there are other things your community is doing, we encourage you to check that other box and tell us about it, so that we can, keep our options accurate and up to date of the latest best practices. So everything I've described so far are all equity related questions in the other E's. And now I'll talk a little bit about the actual equity and accessibility section of the application. It will have 4 subsections: staffing committees and partnerships, data collection and goals, policies and plans, and then the bonus point section that all the other E's have as well. So first, staffing committees and partnerships will ask you about a diversity, equity, and inclusion person or initiative or department in your community. This question actually already existed on the application. It used to be an evaluation and planning, and we've moved it here. We've also seen a lot of communities having equity committees or transportation equity committees, so we'll ask you about that. And then we also want to know if you have a disability services department or office of disability rights, etc. So for all 3 of these questions, if you say yes, there's a series of follow-up questions of, is this person or is this committee engaged in biking at all, biking issues at all in your community? Have you worked with them on your bike plan, etc.? And we encourage those conversations to be happening, because a lot of communities do have these kinds of positions or departments, but they're not really talking to the people planning bike facilities. So we want to encourage those conversations to happen. The other conversations we want to encourage to happen are with a wide range of partners across the community. So this is a really, really long list in the equity section of community partners who have the potential to help the biking program reach new audiences. So this doesn't necessarily need to be the city working directly with these groups. This question could also include how bike advocates are working with some of these groups, and sort of all the various cross collaboration that can happen. But thinking really creatively about employment centers or affordable housing agencies, parks and recreation, public libraries, churches, etc. All the different ways that you can access and reach out to people who maybe don't bike yet, but have been wanting to and aren't sure how to start. So hopefully by encouraging these kinds of partnerships and just planting this seed in people's minds, our hope is to start some of these conversations happening in communities with some of those partners. The next section is data collection and goals. So here are just 2 sample questions from that section. Does your community collect or track any other bike-related data or socioeconomic or demographic details that hasn't already been mentioned elsewhere on the application? We know that it's likely that you've already talked about it somewhere else on the application, so don't feel like you have to repeat yourself if you already told us about it in the education section or the evaluation and planning section. But if there is anything else that you missed, we wanted to give you a space to talk about it. And then, has your community established any specific and measurable equity-related goals or performance measures that relate to bicycling? And this one, might also be duplicative of where we've asked about goals elsewhere in the application under evaluation and planning, but we wanted to call it out. And in this case, we kind of do want you to repeat yourself if there are equity specific goals so that we know, and we can help you keep track of how you're doing on those goals the next time you renew. And the next set of questions sorry, I'm waiting for my slides. There we go. The next set of questions under policies and plans ask about, this was actually mirrored almost exactly with the way we phrased it on the survey earlier this spring, but has your community conducted any equity-centered analysis as part of a community bicycle master plan, Vision Zero action plan, Safe Routes to School plan, ADA transition plan, or other similar planning effort? So if you say yes, we'll ask you for more details. And we know that this might happen more with some plans than others, or it might be a brand new effort with an update to a plan, and that's exactly what we want to encourage. And then one other question I'll showcase from the new equity and accessibility section is a focus on anti-displacement strategies, recognizing that communities are doing this at different scales all across the country, but in a lot of communities, this is a very important piece when there's a new development, having some kind of anti-displacement program or strategy in place to make sure that the improvements that are happening in your community benefit the current residents and don't just make it another way that segregation happens in our nation. So intentionally, developing strategies to engage the community members, make sure the projects meet their goals, understanding what their goals are, et cetera. And this is something that, while there are relatively few examples around the country, we're collecting those examples. We had a really great workshop on this topic at the National Bike Summit this year in person, unfortunately, so it wasn't recorded. But there's great research and some really great examples that we have been adding to our resources library on the BFC application or on the BFC website. So we'll continue to keep that updated as we hear about new examples. And then the last part of the application that I'll mention that is brand new and kind of equity related is we're adding a new section to the BFC application about funding resources to help BFCs identify the funding that is available. And one of the series of questions to help communities see if there's more funding available than they realize is every state has to allocate a certain amount of money to communities that they identify as high need. So there is certainly an equity component to this to make sure that those high need communities are getting the funds that are due to them. And there are a lot of other equity measures in some of the grants that are available from federal down to local dollars. So we want to help communities identify those funding opportunities so that lower resourced communities aren't left behind and are able to find the funding needed to build out great bike networks and great bike parking and great bike education programs for them as well. So stay tuned for more about that. It's a brand new section that will continue to grow and evolve on the BFC application. So now I'm going to talk just a little bit about how we're integrating equity into our processes. Everything I've described so far was integrating equity into the application. But I also think it's important for you all to know about what we're doing internally to make sure we're continuing to sort of walk this walk as much as we're talking it. So in 2020, we developed something called the BFA Equity Fellowship, which specifically recruits BIPOC individuals and others with diverse backgrounds and experiences to help us with BFC reviews. And they're asked not only to review a set of applications from that given round, but also to give us input on the actual application itself. And we will continue to do that and grow that program going forward. It's been a really great effort to just keep equity conversations happening every single review round. So stay tuned for more information about sort of how we'll be growing that program. But it's been working really well for the last couple of years, and I'm excited to expand it. I'll talk more about this in a moment, but we've been updating our surveys for the public, and going forward, there's a lot we plan to do to continue to build on the work we've done so far. So the Equity Fellowship, I already went into this detail, but since I have a slide on it, I'll say it again. This is about both diversifying our review panel, but also intentionally seeking input on equity-related topics. And this is a compensated position, the fellowship role. That's very important from an equity standpoint, not asking people to do that work for free. And we do hope to open this up in the fall to invite people to apply to become fellows going forward, and have sort of a 2-year cycle of fellowships. So stay tuned for more on that. We do a public survey for every community that applies to the BFC program. And since 2016, we've had that survey completely open to the public, and we ask our applicants to send it out as far and wide as they can. And we send it to all League members whose zip code matches the community, and to any advocates we know in the community, and ask for their help distributing it. So we've had almost 70,000 responses since 2016, which is really exciting. And in 2020, we began asking demographic questions to understand how representative these surveys were. So right now, the demographic questions on the survey have just been age, gender, and race. And on the race question, there's an option to click other and fill in the blank. And something I was surprised, but maybe shouldn't have been so surprised by, was how many people checked the other box and answered with responses like this. Why does race always seem to matter? Are you kidding? No idea what this has to do with anything. So these were real answers that people put in the survey, which I, to be honest, appreciated, because it pointed out to me that we have some education to do. If we're going to ask this question, we need to tell people why we're asking this question. So I'm to tell you all, but we'll tell the survey respondents going forward as well. We want to make sure that responses are representative. And as I described at the beginning of this webinar, we know that there are disparities in race, age, gender, et cetera, in terms of who's riding, how safe they feel, who has access to different facilities, et cetera. And so we want to see, are there racialized or other demographic trends in the attitudes, behaviors, or barriers that are communicated in the survey for any given community. So we'll be able to compare this to the demographic information that the community reports in their census section of the application. And it will be interesting to see how these correlate. And we'll be able to do some across community analysis as well, to see across the country, are there trends in the types of barriers or preferences that we're seeing. And I also want to point out that talking about race is really essential, and it's something that, this is a magazine article from the League's 2018, I think, summer issue of our member magazine, featuring Aisha McGowan wrote this article for us. It's awkward to talk about race, let's do it anyway. And she makes some great arguments about what a privilege it is to not see color, and as a person of color in the cycling industry, how she has experienced it, and making the case that, yes, we do need to talk about race. Another fantastic voice on this topic I'll point you all to is Tamika Butler. In 2020, Bicycling Magazine worked with her on producing an entire issue of the magazine about this topic. And she wrote a fantastic cover article, Why We Must Talk About Race When We Talk About Bikes. So if you or anyone in your community is wondering why we're asking about this on the survey, I will also point you to these experts on why this topic matters and why we need to be talking about it, including on our public surveys and for the BFC program. So one other change we've made to the survey last year, and this was actually an idea from one of our BFA Equity Fellows, was to begin asking about barriers to bicycling for those who respond that they don't currently bike. historically, the survey was kind of assumed to be for people who bike. And if you didn't bike, why would you bother filling out the survey? And she made the very good point that we're missing a huge part of the audience of the community if we're not asking about from the people who were interested enough to click the survey link but don't bike, what's keeping you from biking? So, you know, we're not saying that these surveys are scientifically valid or statistically, you know, scientifically perfect, but there's still some really interesting data, and we share the survey results with the community so that they can see the responses and do their own analysis. So I'm excited to have these 2 new questions in the application or in the survey, so that people filling out the BFC application can hear from residents who don't bike what's keeping them from biking and what would get them to bike more often. And from an equity standpoint, I think that's a really important thing to continue to ask. So the next steps for the survey continue to educate why we're asking the demographic questions and using that demographic data to do some analysis. We'll also be working really intentionally to expand how we distribute the surveys. So we're now asking for bike co-op contact information and that club contact information that we collect on the BFC application. Part of why we ask that is so that we can send those groups the survey and ask for their help distributing the survey. We also now have a Spanish language version of the survey available, so communities will be able to request this. Last fall, I got 2 requests from communities, including one that said they couldn't distribute our English language survey if they didn't have a Spanish language one to go with it. That was a community-wide policy. And it really stuck with me that we didn't have that at the time. So I want to thank Samantha Pearson at the Pennsylvania Downtown Center, who helped us get this survey translated so that starting this fall, communities that would like a Spanish language version to distribute in their communities will be able to do so. And we'll give those communities the full results so that they can do their own analysis. So once again, I've talked a little bit about the steps we've already taken. Going forward, later this summer, we will be conducting focus groups with BFCs who filled out that survey this spring to go into a little more detail to help us establish the matrix of what we should expect by different award levels. And later this year, we'll be releasing updated report cards as well as updated materials and the updated information on the matrix of standards by award levels. So I know that's something communities are really eager to get. So stay tuned for more information in the fall. And the BFC application is going to be live momentarily, or if you're watching this later, it should be live by then. It really will be live this week, I promise. And the first deadline to apply once we do reopen it is September 29th. The next deadline after that is February 15th. And after that, we'll be back on our regular schedule with deadlines every February and August. And announcements every May and December. So with that, that was a whole lot of information, but if there are any questions, I think we have 10 minutes or so to answer them. And thank you again to Anna for responding to things in chat. Yeah, Anna, if you want to come on and let me know if there are any questions, I'd be happy to.
Hey, for some reason it says my video has stopped working, so okay. It's like I will just be talking to you. I'm sorry about that, but we did have a question about how you're addressing equity from an age perspective, especially around children.
Yeah, so there's a series of questions both in education and encouragement that are just focused on children and youth. And the education ones include in school and out of school. The encouragement ones are, a series of different ways that you can sort of engage with youth and children and family focused groups. And then that long list of partners in the equity section, we include things like daycare centers for the younger children. So I think those are the main the main things that come to mind. We do have questions, for example, on the bike share section, there's a checkbox for whether children can be carried on the bike share program bikes, if that's something that's available. So there are little pieces here and there throughout other sections of the application that touch on that. But that's a great question.
Yeah. Okay. So the next question is around awards that are given out to communities. And if you could talk about like the rate at which things are communities are awarded and like their level that they receive.
Yeah, so historically, first-time applicants, only about 60% of them, 60% of first-time applicants do actually not get an award. Sorry, I did not say that very well. 60% of first-time applicants get either no award or honorable mention, and about 40% of first-time applicants get an award, bronze or higher. Rarely do they get higher. We have had some first-time silvers. And I think when the program started, probably 20 years ago, there might have been some first-time golds, but it's been a very long time since that's happened. So most communities that apply on their very first try, they get feedback from us on how to improve, and we encourage them to take some time to make improvements. And I will be very honest, with the equity updates, we will be releasing updated standards and criteria for each award level. And we don't expect to demote anyone in the first few years of this updated application. We're going to give every renewing community sort of one pass at the updated application before we say, look, you've had a full review round and you still haven't made any progress on these new areas. We would really like to see you focus on this before you can renew your award level. So that may happen. It will be interesting to see, but we're sort of prepared for that. But these standards are important, and we want communities to take them seriously. So that being said, I don't know how to answer that for new first-time applicants going forward. But I will say that I think the updated criteria, one of our big goals with this, especially from an equity lens standpoint, is to make sure that the application really meets communities where they are, so that a small town, a rural community is not expected to have all the same things that a big, well-resourced city would have. So we'll be able to show you on the matrix sort of more transparently that different communities, have sort of different standards that are appropriate for them. Similar to how, protected bike lanes aren't necessary on every single street. A slow speed street, can be fine with just some good traffic calming. Similarly, depending on the community, the context really matters, and what standards we put out there, we will make sure that it is sort of context appropriate for communities. So I hope that helps in not scaring away any communities from applying when they hear that 60% number.
Thank you. The next question is around the survey that gets sent out. So if you could talk a little bit about like who gets it, when it gets launched, and like when it's made available.
Yeah, so the survey happens right after the deadline. So this year, with the deadline on September 29th, the surveys will go out to applicant communities the first week of October. And it's normally open for about a month to a month and a half, depending on sort of when we are in the year. We try to make sure it's available for a little bit of warm weather. So for that February deadline, we keep the survey open a little bit longer for communities that maybe have harsh winters throughout March. So we send the survey link to every contact who's listed on the application. And we really encourage communities to submit applications with a lot of collaborative input from community members. So hopefully there are a lot of people getting that survey link directly from us through the application itself. And then we'll ask them to distribute the survey. We'll actually also give everyone who's involved in the application a toolkit with suggestions and ideas for how they could distribute the survey. And then we send it directly to every league member whose zip code matches the community and any league member groups that are in the community or near the community. For example, a statewide advocacy group would get the survey for every community in their state. And we'd ask all of those advocates for their help distributing it to their members as well. So it goes out a lot of different ways. Some communities post it on, Facebook or Twitter and get a lot of activity. Some communities have done QR codes and they post printed flyers on their trails. So we've seen a lot of creativity to get the word out about surveys. The more responses, the better, because it's a lot of great input to help our review team better understand the community, but also because we share those survey results back with the applicants so that they can hear directly from the cyclists and potential cyclists in their community.
Awesome. Thank you. There's two more questions. The first one is if you could talk a little bit about addressing gentrification and like how to address that within your community.
Yeah, that's a big question. So that's part of why we've added that question around anti-displacement, is to get at that question of gentrification. And I would say there have been some really great webinars done on this topic that I would point you to. And I think we point to this one in our resources, but if not, I'll make sure I add the link. But APBP did a webinar last October on this topic with some researchers, one of whom we brought to the summit, again in person. So I'm sorry we don't have a recording of it, but there are some really good resources on this topic and some examples. And I think it's a relatively new topic for a lot of communities to be thinking about. So this is one we want to offer a lot of support. And this is not something we'll expect communities to have figured out overnight, but we hope that we can help communities solve this. So it's a much more complex answer than I could give in today's webinar in our remaining 4 minutes, but I will say that we have a lot of resources to help with that. So thanks for the question, and I'm glad there's interest in that.
Yeah. The next one is, have you considered asking for a distribution of bicyclists by age? So there's a series of questions about data collection in the evaluation and planning section of the application. And one of those questions one of those answer options is just vaguely demographics for cyclists. So by age would definitely count for that. But it's a good thing we should point out to communities that they sort of should do that more intentionally, because that does seem like one that any community should be able to have some interesting data on if they're doing data collection. And that is it.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate everybody's time today and listening to the webinar, and especially if you've attended multiple of our webinars this week. I really, really appreciate everybody who's been involved over the last several months, giving us input and sharing your time and expertise and energy with us. I can't say it enough. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And also that we're not done yet. So please continue to send us your feedback and input, especially once the application is live, which I'm going to go work on right now. So it will be up soon. Thank you again, everyone. Take care. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.